So, welcome to our last unit. Even as the fighting raged on in World War II, leaders in England, the United States, and Russia began to negotiate about what the post-World War II world would look like. And there were a whole lot of complicated issues, but really one big question. How could they avoid repeating the mistakes of World War I? How could they prevent returning to war in another 20 years? I think it's easier to keep all of these post-war conferences straight if you think about them as efforts to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. So, for example, how could the German people possibly have believed that they could win against the combined forces of the rest of Europe and the United States after it didn't work the first time? What does this cartoon suggest might be an answer to that question? Well, after World War I, many people in Germany did not believe that Germany had really lost the war. After all, Germany was never invaded. The war didn't come home to the German people. So maybe it's not surprising, especially after all those victories in the East, that many Germans thought that the soldiers had been betrayed by politicians at the Versailles Conference. And, of course, Hitler was very quick to egg them on to believe that the reason was that ever-convenient scapegoat, the Jews. So one of the things that Churchill and Roosevelt were determined was that this time the Germans would know they'd been beaten fair and square. At the Casablanca Conference, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed that surrender must be unconditional. The Germans must be totally defeated and they must be occupied. Stalin wasn't around for this conference, but he would show up in the next one. Another lesson of World War I and its aftermath was that Germany needed to lose decisively on both fronts. When Russia surrendered and signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany was free to send all of its troops to the Western Front. Only the late entry of America into the war really saved Britain and France from disaster, and frankly, it was something of a near thing. In 1943, recognize our friend Dr. Seuss again, Stalin was feeling angry and frustrated. Russia had taken a terrible beating at the hands of the Nazis. At the Battle of Stalingrad, the Russian army had turned the tide of the war. So now Stalin was asking, not unreasonably, where are the American troops? When are you going to invade Europe and take some pressure off my soldiers? This photo shows the three leaders meeting in Tehran in November of 1943. I wonder if Churchill or Roosevelt reminded Stalin of the deal he had cut with Nazi Germany in 1939 to divide up Eastern Europe between them. I'm guessing not. Everyone was trying very hard at this point to preserve the wartime alliance, and Roosevelt in particular wanted to carry it into the post-war world. Churchill was frankly a lot more skeptical of the possibility of that. Actually, the Western Allies had already invaded Italy a few months earlier. I didn't talk about that in my World War II lecture. But at Tehran, Churchill and Roosevelt promised a major invasion of France, and they delivered 7 months later at D-Day. This map and the readings about the Battle of Stalingrad that you did in the last unit should help you understand one reason why Soviet Russia turned out to be so hostile after World War II. The Russians had fought a very hard war. Remember those casualty statistics? It's actually an issue right now because Russia is celebrating the 70th anniversary of its victory over Germany. And other world leaders who are teed off at Russian President Vladimir Putin for his aggressive policies toward his neighbors have been boycotting those celebrations. So what lesson from World War I and its aftermath does this cartoon reinforce? No more spineless caving into dictators, right? No more Munichs. No more carrying an umbrella off to conferences and saying peace in our time. Next time, the world would pay a lot more attention to the rise of dictators and give more support to democratic leaders, or at least that's what Churchill and Roosevelt thought. This, in fact, is where the trouble really begins to set in. By the time Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met at Yalta on the Black Sea in February of 1945, Russian forces were already just 40 miles from Berlin, and Roosevelt and Churchill were increasingly nervous about what this was going to mean for Europe's future. Remember, the Russians had invaded Eastern Europe once before in 1939, when they were dividing Poland up with Hitler. President Roosevelt was also very anxious to get Russian support for the war against Japan and for the proposed new United Nations, which was supposed to be a much stronger and more effective successor to the League of Nations. And Roosevelt thought that he and Uncle Joe Stalin had reached an understanding. Again, for what it's worth, Churchill was a lot more skeptical. At Yalta, Stalin told Churchill and Roosevelt, quote, "For the Soviet government, the question of Poland is one of honor and security because Poland has served as a historical corridor for forces attempting to invade Russia." Of course, Russia has also invaded Poland, but Stalin also promised that he would allow for free elections in Poland. They wouldn't happen. By the time of the Potsdam Conference, President Roosevelt was dead and had been succeeded by President Truman. Prime Minister Churchill had been voted out of office, and Prime Minister Clement Attlee from the more left-leaning Labour Party was in power. Truman was a lot less inclined to trust Stalin than Roosevelt had been, especially as more and more reports were reaching the United States about how countries conquered by the Soviet Red Army were being forced to adopt communist governments and swear allegiance to the Russians. So Truman decided not to inform Comrade Stalin of a little detail about the ongoing war effort, that is, that the United States had developed an atomic bomb. When the U.S. dropped 2 of these bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Stalin was furious that he hadn't been informed, and relations deteriorated further. But America, Britain, and France and Russia still did reach an agreement to break Germany into 4 sectors for occupation. You see that on the map here. The Russian sector would later become the separate country of East Germany. The capital, Berlin, was deep in the Russian sector, but it too was divided between the 4 powers. And now we reach the point in our story where the post-war alliance pretty much breaks down and a new so-called Cold War begins. So let's time travel again to Berlin, 1945, and see the incredible challenge facing post-war Europe. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the U.S. was beginning to disband its military and to celebrate a prosperous peace. It looks like, just like after World War I, the U.S. was going to fold up its tents and go away. Americans were eager to return to normal peacetime life, but this time the United States did not retreat back into isolationism. It had learned this lesson from World War I. And due in part to a warning from Winston Churchill, due even more to Soviet actions in Eastern Europe, the United States let itself be drawn back into European affairs and indeed decided to take a leading role in rebuilding a prosperous democratic Europe. So let's continue with this video. And now we head back to Berlin. Remember that East Berlin was entirely surrounded by East Germany, now a communist country under the complete control of Soviet Russia. But the British, French, and American sectors of Berlin were little islands of freedom, and thousands of Germans, actually I think the final figure was 3.5 million, gained passage to the west by crossing the border in Berlin and then leaving from there to West Germany. The Soviets, faced with this tremendous drain of population, including a lot of its most talented and well-educated people, decided to take action. So we'll return to the video and see what happened. This is one of the great stories of the Cold War and really of the American involvement in Europe. So, did you catch that the candy bomber was from Utah? Actually, Gail Halverson was born in Salt Lake City. In your readings, you have an interview that he gave in 2009. So let's take a break from the video and read this interview, which I think is quite wonderful. After the Berlin airlift in particular, the Soviet Union mounted a major propaganda effort to counter the attractive pull of the West, especially for the people of Eastern Germany. On the right, on the left, you see a 1948 Soviet poster that made its appearance just a few weeks into the Berlin blockade. The person in the cartoon is actually French leader Charles de Gaulle. He's standing among a bunch of irate world leaders as they cuss out the Red Army. The caption reads, "Firebugs of the new war would do well to remember the dishonorable end of their predecessors." The poster on the right says, Do not fool around. You notice the large Russian soldier and the small, silly-looking Uncle Sam. Let's watch some excerpts from Soviet propaganda films of the time. But not all of the sensational propaganda came from the Soviet Union. Now let's take a look at American newsreel that sounds pretty extreme as well. You'll learn more about this side of the Cold War in American history next year. We did not kill off millions of people or build concrete and barbed wire walls, but it still wasn't America's finest hour, especially when it came to protecting civil liberties. But what may have been America's finest hour was the decision to spend millions of dollars helping European countries rebuild their economies, partly, of course, with the aim of discouraging Western European countries from embracing communism. There were a lot of communists in Western Europe at this time. France and Italy in particular had very strong communist parties. Remember how after World War I, the Allies forced Germany to pay huge reparations with disastrous consequences? After World War II, the United States sent $1.4 billion, which is almost $10 billion in today's dollars, to Germany alone. So you have this chart in your notes. And again, remember that you have to multiply each number by 7 to get a sense of what this aid would have amounted to in current dollars. Note that the largest recipients are Britain and France, but that many countries received assistance. And the results were pretty amazing. This chart is a little hard to read, so let me help you interpret it. The 100, that's the line that goes across where it says pre-war equals 100, is basically the baseline. It represents economic output at the time the wars began. 2 years after both World War I and World War II, economic output in Britain, France, and Germany had dropped dramatically. After World War II, economic output in those three countries was only about half of pre-war economic output. Note that World War I's economic impact wasn't initially quite as bad. Economic output at the end of the war was only was about 75% of its pre-war levels. But look at the difference in what happens next. 20 years after World War I, economic output was only up about 30%. And for much of the intervening time, the continent had been mired in a Great Depression and wasn't progressing at all. 20 years after World War II, economic output in Europe, or that is in Britain, France, and Germany, had risen almost 200%, or about 20% a year. That's an extraordinary growth rate. Much of this economic success reflects a deliberate decision, again, not to repeat the mistakes of World War II. So, for example, instead of engaging in trade wars, European countries signed treaties that opened up trade with each other, eliminated tariffs and trade barriers. Western Europe formed a union, now the European Union, that let goods and eventually people travel freely across its borders. The U.S. gave aid instead of trying to collect debts. There were no reparations, and the clearly guilty country, Germany, received substantial aid from the countries it had attacked. So maybe we do sometimes learn from our mistakes. But an even bigger lesson of World War I was that democratic leaders need to stand together against aggression by dictators. It's a little hard to read that, but it says, why should we take a stand about someone pushing someone else when it's all so far away? And you notice that it's eventually going to knock them down, what came to be known as the domino theory. Instead, the conclusion now was that the best way to prevent war was to maintain military strength and to indicate a willingness to use it. In other words, good old Theodore Roosevelt, walk softly and carry a big stick. Immediately after the war, Americans had hoped that the United Nations might succeed where the League of Nations had failed. But since the Soviet Union had a veto power in the Security Council of the new organization, the UN was not going to be an effective barrier to Soviet aggression. So in 1949, the major World War II allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They signed a treaty promising to come to one another's aid in the event of an attack. This was not like the vaguely worded, sort of feel-good anti-war declarations of the post-World War I era, like the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Instead, this treaty was backed up with a serious military commitment, including the stationing of a large mass of American troops on the European continent, what defense analysts call forward deployment. This was something very new for America. It was also a huge step forward in providing collective security, the all for one and one for all idea. The theory behind the establishment of NATO was what American political leaders called containment. NATO was going to prevent the Soviet bloc from continuing to expand. Basically, it was going to hold the line at the line that Winston Churchill had called the Iron Curtain. The man who came up with the term was a diplomat named George Kennan, and he thought that eventually communism would collapse from its own internal contradictions and problems. Back when I was taking history in high school, my teacher thought that this was ridiculously optimistic, except that eventually it came true. We'll get there. In 1955, just 10 years after the end of World War II, West Germany joined NATO in response, and partly because they feared a rearmed Germany, the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites formed the Warsaw Pact. This map shows the nations of NATO and the Warsaw Pact in the late 1960s. NATO countries are in blue, Warsaw Pact countries are in red. The border between NATO and the Warsaw Pact was, in fact, the de facto Iron Curtain. The countries in yellow, by the way, were formally neutral. Spain, Ireland, Switzerland, Austria, and Sweden were considered aligned with the West, but they were not party to the NATO treaty. Spain joined NATO in 1982 when General Franco died and it became a democracy. Yugoslavia was a communist country, but it managed to establish some independence from the Soviet Union, which irritated the Soviet Union a great deal, by the way. We're going to talk a little more about Yugoslavia when we get to the fall of communism and what happens when Yugoslavia disintegrates into its previous component parts. After the fall of communism, many of the Eastern European nations that had been members of the Warsaw Pact actually became members of NATO. They were, of course, worried about Russia. The Warsaw Pact officially dissolved in 1991. So one of the big question marks hanging over Europe today is what role NATO should play as Vladimir Putin's Russia is increasingly threatening its neighbors. Something worth following in the news. So I am going to race through the first hot war of the Cold War. I hope you'll study it in more detail next year. Basically, China became a communist country in 1949 under Mao Zedong. We talked about that. We talked about the Great Leap Forward. Korea was divided into a communist North and a non-communist South. In June of 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. We know now that Stalin had encouraged the invasion. He wanted a communist victory, and he calculated that Western countries wouldn't want to intervene in a war so far away. They just wouldn't care enough about what happened in Korea, and he'd have a chance to have a victory. And, of course, to directly challenge this theory of containment. In fact, the United Nations declared war on North Korea. As it happens, the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN at the time. It didn't have time to exercise its veto power. What followed was a very bloody war, made bloodier when the U.S. Army got too close to China and the Chinese Communist Army invaded with 200,000 troops. In the end, the war was a stalemate with a truce declared along the earlier boundary between North and South Korea. But the war did indicate that the United States and its allies were serious about containment and that they would apply that principle outside of Europe. But what would happen if people behind the Iron Curtain weren't satisfied with the strategy of containing communism, especially when that meant they would be contained on the communist side of the Iron Curtain? Well, this was tested in 1956 when the people of Hungary, led, by the way, by students, revolted against Soviet rule. They assumed, or at least hoped, that America would come to their aid. America did not. Let's look at another video clip and then read an eyewitness account of this event. The message of the Hungarian uprising seemed to be that the United States and Europe would not allow communism to advance further, but they weren't going to fight to roll it back either. The next European Cold War crisis came again in Berlin. It produced what is perhaps the most iconic symbol of the Cold War and later of the fall of communism, the Berlin Wall. Once again, it was a victory of sorts for containment, but it was a sad and ugly victory. So let's go back to our video. By the way, historians debate what would have happened if NATO had driven tanks down the autobahns to Berlin and torn down the wall themselves. And there are a substantial number who now think the Soviets would have caved in, partly because we have a lot more access to Soviet documents since the fall of communism. But it's also true that the Soviets might have decided to start a nuclear war instead. It's easy to second guess earlier decisions when we aren't bearing the awesome responsibility of preventing nuclear holocausts. Anyway, in Europe, the struggle between the East and West seemed pretty straightforward. Soviet propaganda notwithstanding, traffic over the Berlin Wall only went one way, and more than 100 people died in desperate attempts to get over into West Berlin. In the rest of the world, the Cold War was a lot messier, and it tended to turn hot. The reason, to way oversimplify, is that the struggle between Western Europe and the United States on the one hand, and the Soviet bloc on the other, got caught up in another struggle, the push for decolonization. This map shows colonies still controlled by foreign countries at the end of World War II. Within 20 years, almost all of these colonies would be independent nations. So this map shows the decolonization process. The first countries to gain their independence, sometimes peacefully, sometimes in bloody wars of independence, were in Asia and Northern Africa. The rest of Africa followed about a decade later, along with the Caribbean, which isn't on this map. So this is a huge story, and we don't have much time for it, alas. I will just look very briefly at two examples of decolonization: British India and French Indochina, the countries that would become Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So, do you remember our crash course history guy? I'm going to let him give you a crash course in the decolonization and subsequent partition of India into India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. To Gandhi and other leaders of the Indian independence movement, the Cold War was really a sideshow. They wanted to stay neutral. They became leaders of what would become known as the non-aligned movement. That is, countries that did not think they had a dog in this fight. But India would take advantage of the efforts by both the United States and the Soviet Union to gain influence there, basically by playing the two sides off each other. Eventually, India became more closely aligned with the United States, mostly because it got embroiled in a war with communist China and needed support. So let's take our crash course. The map you see now is Southeast Asia before World War II. Siam, or Thailand, managed to remain independent, partly with the support of the United States. But most of the rest was gobbled up by France and Britain, or in the case of Indonesia, which you don't see on this map, the Netherlands. The English left India very quickly after the war, maybe too quickly. It's possible that a more deliberate transition would have led to fewer people dying in the process. They might have been able to prevent some of the terrible massacres that occurred. But the new Labour Party government under Prime Minister Attlee did not believe in imperialism, and it cost way too much. England was flat broke. The Dutch and the French fought harder to keep their colonies. They fought nasty little wars that they lost. It was just a lot bloodier. What made Vietnam so complicated, however, was that the revered leader of the patriotic independence movement, Ho Chi Minh, was also a dedicated communist. The United States was a NATO ally of France, but NATO did not commit Americans to defend colonialism, and American leaders were very disinclined to do so. We had given up the Philippines on July 4th, 1946, and we would have done it sooner had the Japanese not conquered the Philippines during World War II. French Indochina, though, posed a different problem because of the communists and because of our policy of containment and because of our fear of the domino theory, that if one country fell, all the other countries would fall like the dominoes you saw in that cartoon. To make a very long story indecently short, the French lost to the Vietnamese. Vietnam was divided into a communist North Vietnam and a non-communist but really quite corrupt and badly governed South Vietnam, and eventually the U.S. got dragged into a long, bloody war with North Vietnam. If you have time for this short History Channel video, it's another crash course. There is, however, actually a happy ending to at least some of the story. Stay tuned. For now, you should be ready for your quiz.